Last time, I was going through the political economy of the Malthusian world, and we were doing this in terms of thinking about what are the virtues in this society and what are vices. And we see that some things are as expected, so fertility limitation is unambiguously better in this society in terms of living standards and life expectancy. But it turns out that things like public health, peace, absence of violence actually reduce living standards in the Malthusian world. Also things like the onset of disease. Again, epidemic disease actually can make living conditions much better. And I'll show you some of this to do with pre-industrial England. And then I went on to say, well, there's another thing that surprisingly turns out to be a virtue in the Malthusian world, which is indolence. And hard work turns out to be a vice. And the reason for that is that if we think of a society starting at a low level of work effort in an initial position, and then what happens is that somehow people become more disciplined, they spend more time working every day. The initial effect of that would simply be to shift out this curve. But in this Malthusian world, anything that looks like a shift in technology in the long run simply results in population increases. And so after this shift has occurred, what will happen in the long run is that the wage has to return. There's the iron law of wages and of subsistence income, that it has to return to that subsistence level. And all of the benefits of that hard work simply go in increasing the level of population in these societies. And so here at the end, you're working 10 hours a day instead of 6. And in fact, you're worse off, right? And so if you could have a social rule in these societies that said you're not allowed to work, or you have to reduce your labor inputs, in the long run, it would actually increase living standards, right? Because it would mean that you would get the same subsistence, but with much less effort within these societies. And so, surprisingly, hunter-gatherer societies, which tend to have these relatively low work efforts, it's actually well adapted to the circumstances that they are living within. It is actually maintaining living standards above what it would otherwise be, though it still is somewhat of a mystery as to why are work efforts so much lower in these societies than they are in modern industrial societies or even in Europe by 1800. So what else do we have that are virtues as opposed to vices? Another thing that turns out to have surprising effects in the pre-industrial world is taxation. And it turns out that taxation in some sense can be regarded as a virtue in this world because it can generate income for the state and for the monarch at no long-run cost to society. It's a free good in this world, taxation. And things like the cathedrals, the palaces, all of that stuff that was built in the pre-industrial world was actually a free good that was bestowed on these societies that didn't actually cost anyone in the society anything. And how would that be the case? Well, again, if we go back to our diagram here, let's think about it from the point of view of suppose we have a king and we have a group of peasants who constitute the bulk of the society and landowners. And the king comes along, and initially there is no taxation. But the king then institutes a 10% tax on all incomes within the society. And he just seizes that and uses it to build, works of art, palaces, culture, all of the things that kings like to do. Okay? What's the effect going to be in the short run and the long run? Well, this is just like a shift inwards of the production technology. Right? It's like 10% of output has now disappeared in the society. It's going to the king, right? Or it's going to the emperor in China. Okay? And in terms of our model, what will initially happen is that in the first generation, there would be a reduction in incomes. But that reduction in incomes now means that the death rate exceeds the birth rate. And so after that first generation reduction, population has to decline in the society, and we eventually are going to move from this point down to this point here. And again, in the long run, the king can collect 10% of the output of the society, but actually at no cost to the average person living in the society. And so taxation is fine in this world. It makes nice things for the king, and it doesn't cost anyone in the long run. Now, if you go to the syllabus and look at the links on the web page, Brian Kaplan and I had an interchange where he objected to this line of reasoning on the grounds that the first generation does get hurt through this process, right? And so that there's an initial generation which will get hurt if the king imposes taxation. But the interesting thing is that if you impose the taxation, have it in place for 10 generations, and then remove it, that first generation will get compensated by a later generation which gets benefited by the removal of the taxes. And so it would say that as long as the taxes start at some point, as long as they end at some other point, you're actually no worse off in the society. It's just you're shifting income between generations. But there is no long-run ill effect. So have a look at that debate, and in the section, Nick can talk about that. But as I say, and it's also the case that it's just a steady state, that if the king has always taxed people in the society, then it's not reducing the average living standards of the society, right? There could only be transitory effects from things like taxation within the society. In terms of the model also, if you want to analyze, now people have got interested in shifts in climate in the past, because we have this interesting puzzle, which is that now we're warming up the Earth, it seems, and there's a lot of concern about, well, are we destroying the climate of the planet? But the interesting thing is that actually the climate of the planet has actually shifted over time in the past. And so it's not clear, should we conserve the present climate? Or should we think about, well, what would be the optimal climate, right? Maybe a little warming would actually be a good thing, because the climate, as I say, has shifted up and down in the past. And so you see in Europe, for example, in the 17th century period that's known as the Little Ice Age, when temperatures were systematically much lower. And then you see in the medieval period, a period of unusual warmth in Europe. And as I say, the climate does fluctuate like this. Again, the question is, what was the effect on human societies in the pre-industrial era of these climate shifts? And the answer is that the climate shifts would function just like these one-time shifts in technology. In times of good climates in Northern Europe or in China, output would go up. In times of bad climates, output would go down. Okay? And in the long run, it doesn't affect living standards in these societies. And by analogy, if we look across the world, we see in the pre-industrial world some areas which are very fertile, there's a lot of sunlight, there's a lot of output, and we see the Arctic, which is very little sunlight, very little output. The important thing to understand is that in the Malthusian world, that doesn't make any effect on living standards if it's just changing the production possibilities. It has no effect on living standards in that sense, right? It's just like taxation or indolence, okay? The way that climate would actually affect living standards in the pre-industrial world would be if it, typically, crucially, if it shifts this death rate schedule. That's what actually would be the source of climate effects on living standards and on income levels in the pre-industrial world. And we'll see when we come to talk about variation in living standards across the world in 1800, that it seems that, for example, sub-Saharan Africa had in the Malthusian era what was a very advantageous climate. That is, it was a climate where people died from a lot of diseases, right? And we've got very good evidence of this because of the colonial period when European troops were shipped around the world and stationed in various places in the world. And it turns out that different parts of the world have very different disease environments. And European, and that explains in part also the pattern of European settlement in the world in this period, because European troops stationed in New Zealand, for example, had no greater, in fact less, mortality than troops coming from France or from England. But Europeans stationed on the west coast of Africa, something like a half of all of those people would die in the first year they were stationed there. And one of the things that kept Africa free from European conquest for a very long period was that Europeans simply could not live in the interior of Africa in the pre-industrial period. But we also think that a side effect, and we also know that Africans themselves are not immune to these diseases. We know that from the experience of Liberia, where a large group of former slaves in the United States moved back to Liberia, actually became the ruling class in this society in Africa. They themselves then also experienced very heavy rates of mortality. And so we know that there wasn't any genetic adaptation in Africa that would make you immune from these diseases. And so one of the things we believe is that living standards seem to have been quite high in pre-industrial Africa, simply in part because of the advantages of having this very adverse disease environment. And in other parts of the world, if you find a very good disease environment, then you would actually expect that living standards there would be very low, right? It's a very cruel world, this, right? In the sense that there is no place that can be good once you have the logic of this, world. If you get to, and we'll see one of the puzzles is when the Europeans came to Tahiti, the climate in Tahiti was wonderful. They didn't have mosquitoes, which saved them from a large variety of diseases that were found in the rest of the world. The very low mortality rates of Europeans who arrive in the South Pacific. That's why it's a paradise. It's balmy, there's sunlight, there's no mosquitoes, there's no disease. One of the puzzles we have to ask then is, why weren't all of the local inhabitants incredibly, miserably poor in this society if it was going to be one where death rates would actually be very low in this world? What you'd actually expect then is to find people living at the very margins of physical subsistence if there isn't some other force that's actually killing people off, right? And so as I say, one of the interesting puzzles then, once you know this model, you can actually look at any society and say, things seem good. There must be something bad about it, right? There must be something that's maintaining high living standards in this world. It can't be just accidental anymore that you have good or bad living standards. So that takes us through indolence, taxation, hard work, fiscal prudence. Another thing that turns out to be good in the Malthusian world is inequality. And a thing that is bad for societies is equality. Okay? So we in the modern world tend to think of inequality as one of the economic vices that we should try and avoid, that highly unequal societies are undesirable, and that we should try as far as possible to equalize income across people. Let's think what happens in the Malthusian world if we had a completely equal society as opposed to a very unequal one. And the way to think about this is, now on the vertical axis, let's put the birth rate minus the death rate. Okay, so it's the difference between birth rates and death rates. So it's taking these two curves and just taking the difference between them, with the birth rate on the bottom here minus the death rate on the top. Okay? And that's why we think it's going to have this shape where, as we get to very low levels of income, that gap will turn out to be very large. But the other thing we expect is that as we get to very high levels of income, that this thing will flatten out. Okay? And the reason for that is there's only a certain number of children that any woman can give birth to. So no matter how good living standards are, the queen can still only give birth to, at maximum, something like 12 children over the course of a lifetime. And so even if all of them survive, there's an upper limit to what the fertility of people can be, even in very, very good economic conditions. And in fact, in natural conditions, you very rarely achieve birth rates as high as 12. So let's start off in this society and have just two individuals and let them have absolute equality of income. Right? In the Malthusian equilibrium now, they're both going to be at this point here. Okay? Because in order for population, births and deaths to balance in the completely equal society, we have to be at this income here, Y star. Suppose now we took these two people, and one of them we made poorer, and the other one we made much richer, or made richer. Suppose we took one person and we put them down here. Now, for their family, there's this excess of deaths over births that's this amount here. to have a long-run equilibrium of population in this world, that excess of deaths over births has to be counterbalanced by an excess of births over deaths in the rich person. And what you can see is that taking a little income away from poor people here would have to be counterbalanced by giving a lot of income to rich people in order to keep births equal to deaths in this society. Because of it's all to do with the curvature of this curve, the assumed curvature of this curve. If it was just a straight line, then the average income of the society would be independent of what the income distribution was. But because it's curved in this way, a society which has more inequality, which has more people really up at the top end of the income distribution here, is going to be one that will have higher average incomes than one that has less inequality. And so the average, and so if you had to choose, right? So think about it this way. Suppose I can put you in a machine and send you back to some pre-industrial society. And I said, well, here's some of the characteristics of the societies. For example, there's one where everyone works hard and there's one where everyone lies around, right? Which one should you go to, right? There's one where it's very equal. Everyone has the same income. Or there's another one where it's very unequal. And you've got an equal probability of ending up anywhere in that income distribution. Which society should you choose? Unless you're very risk averse, what you'd actually say is put me in the unequal society, right? Because that's going to be a society where on average incomes are going to be higher. And at the extreme of this, just think about the king here. Suppose the king seizes another 10% of the income of the society, right? That's increasing the inequality in the society. But at the lower end here, people would have to still get the same income because that would have no effect on the fertility level of the society. And so it's just another demonstration of this idea of why taxation is not necessarily bad, because what we're assuming is that when the king taxes, it doesn't increase his fertility level, and consequently, it can't depress average incomes of the rest of the people in the society. And so similarly, the upper end here, any gains by the very upper group within the population would have no effect on the living standards of the lower group in the population here. And so once we get to extreme income inequality, it's all free at the upper end of society. The dukes, the barons, the upper classes of pre-industrial China, in some sense, they didn't exploit the masses. They got all of that free, right? Through ownership of land and other assets in the society, they could have a free gift, which was this very high living standards, but not at any cost to the living standards of the main group within these societies. And so that's, as I say, you should now have a sense of just how bizarre this world is because of a lot of our ordinary intuitions, right? And so this would be like now the corporates of finance in the New York now. We know that they got all of that money at the expense of the rest of society, right? And that other people were hurt by that, and that's why there's a strong reason to worry about that structure. But if you went back to Europe in 1700 and looked at the rich families then, you could say, well, they got their money. But it's actually the case they didn't hurt anyone, right? It was a free gift that they actually obtained in this case, in the sense of they didn't reduce living standards for the rest of the population in that society. And so that's why, as I say, that's why it really is, in terms of this model, if this model is correct, it really is a very different world before 1800 compared to the world that comes after 1800. And one last thing, just in terms of the structure of this model, that I should emphasize, and that is that we drew this for a human society, but we could draw, if we wanted to describe animal societies, and if ecologists want to describe animal societies, they effectively use exactly the same models, right? And instead of income here, we'd have something like calorie consumption, right? So if we wanted to describe a wildebeest society, right, we'd have calorie consumption here, and what we would find is that birth rates increase when living conditions are good on the savanna, and that death rates decline when living conditions are good. And that consequently, in all of these animal societies, there's going to be some subsistence level of nutrition that just keeps births and deaths in balance. And that if the productivity of the grasses on the savanna changes, all it'll do in the long run is change the stock of animals that are out there on the savannah, right? It won't change living conditions. And we could also think about things like, for instance, the death rate like predators, that we could actually predict, well, what would the effect of predators be in terms of average nutrition levels, and that's why you would say it's better for a herd often that it gets culled periodically, because it will actually allow it to live with better average nutritional conditions, and that you can get the equivalent of overpopulation. When natural predators disappear, the death rate goes down, and you end up with a lot of fairly sickly animals in this society. And so what's interesting is that in some sense, we were not truly human before 1800. We were just an animal like all the other animals, and the laws of human economics were just the laws of animal economics. And it's only since 1800 that people have now entered a new world where we're different in terms of the description of human behavior in human societies than it would be for animal societies, right? It's only in this modern period that we've actually entered a world where you say we need a completely different model to understand the economics of human societies. And before 1800, as I say, there is this amazing unity between human and animal societies in terms of how they operated. So that's the model. The next thing, and the important thing to understand is that the way we think about the world, right, and particularly the way this book thinks about the world, is we have to have some idea, some theory, some model that then we take to the data. I'm getting so excited here, I'm losing this. And that then we take to the data. And there's always going to be a question, which is this the right model, right? And hopefully, a model can be oversimplified where it's essentially the right model, but you need to add complications, or a model can just be dramatically wrong. And one of the reasons this approach is very controversial is that a lot of people believe that this model just cannot describe pre-industrial society. But then we'd have to think, well, what model would describe this society, right? Because we do know of these societies that they had this extraordinary stability of population. We'll see some evidence about what happened to living standards, how it varied. And so the interesting thing would be, if it's not going to be this model, you have to think, well, what's the other model that would actually describe how human living conditions were determined in the period before 1800? And one of the arguments for this model is simply, it's impossible to think of any other model. No one has formulated any other picture of these societies that would explain this, right? And as I say, we'll see that this model has very powerful implications, and a lot of them, in the next chapter, chapter 3, we'll see are actually satisfied, right? That it passes a lot of tests in this world. So let's then go through and think about what are the major claims we want to test. And the first of these, the most dramatic one, is that there's no expectation of any improvement in human living conditions between when the original hunter-gatherers appeared on the African savanna and 1800. That really you have no expectation of any systematic increase. There could be fluctuations up and down. We've seen that not all pre-industrial societies will have the same living conditions. But there's no expectation that on average things were getting better over this period. They could fluctuate. It could by accident be that things were worse or things were better. But there's no expectation that there's progress. The progress is something that only appears after 1800 in terms of human living conditions. And we also expect, actually, in terms of this model, that we'll see substantial variation in living conditions in the pre-industrial period because of the fact that those birth rate and death rate schedules can shift around between societies, and that we won't get one subsistence income. We'll actually observe many different incomes. Now, if we want to measure income, the most complete measures are actually quite difficult to do. And, for example, we have to look at what are the real wages of people, right? And what's the real income of people? And we measure that by looking at all the goods they consumed and the relative value of those goods to people. And so a complete measure of welfare, for example, has to look at the entire pattern of consumption of people in different societies. And then we also had to add to that there's a value also to health conditions and life expectancy conditions, and that we'd have to take that into account as well. And there's a value also to leisure. Leisure is one of the great goods of consumption. My teenage son is at home at present because there's no school this week, engaging in massive consumption of leisure, right? And it's an economic output like any other output. And it actually turns out there's an interesting puzzle actually in the modern world, which is that the US is the richest major industrial society in the world. And we have incomes that are about 20 or 25% higher than most European societies. It turns out, though, one of the reasons we have so much higher income is because we work much more than in European societies. If you correct output for labor inputs, European societies in that measure are just as rich as is modern America. And since they actually have better life expectancy and better health conditions in most of these societies, the argument would be is if they're just choosing to consume more leisure than Americans are, those are actually the richest societies in the world, right? And just because we tend to focus on these partial measures, it makes it seem like somehow the US economy is much more successful than it really is. And there's actually a lot of debate about that, because one argument that's been made is that Europeans take so much leisure simply because they have such high tax rates in Europe. And when you tax any good, people try to avoid the taxes, and one of the things you can't tax is leisure, right? So a perfect tax system would tax my son as he lies in his bed this morning and make him make correct decisions about goods versus leisure, right? And so it's actually this kind of interesting puzzle as to also why societies end up at this distant equilibrium, right? One argument of Europeans is that Americans work so hard because it's such a dull society that there's nothing else to do but work, right? That Europe has much richer culture, much more opportunities for other activities, that people have better social structures, they spend more time with each other. And the high labor inputs in America reflect just the emptiness of the society, right? That people don't have anything to do with their leisure. It's very little value in America. In Oklahoma, what do you do with leisure? Shoot things. Sorry. Let me take that joke back. And so that it's one of the things then that we have to consider in terms of a complete measure of living standards across societies. Now, there's only very, very few societies where we can get anything like that complete measure before 1800. It turns out that one of those is England, where we can actually measure living conditions pretty well. It gets weaker as we go further back, but pretty well all the way from 1200 to 1800. And that's actually astonishing that we have such good data for England. And there's actually an important historical reason for this, which is that England was actually, in many ways, an extraordinarily peaceable and stable society through all of this period. England was very rarely invaded. I mean, the heartland of England essentially was never invaded after 1200, right? It fought most of its wars in other countries, and it destroyed a lot of other countries. And then internally, there was very little conflict. There were periods of warfare, there were disputes. They were pretty confined to the aristocratic classes. Even the Civil War in the 17th century, we know that most people weren't particularly threatened by this war. And one of the reasons we know that is we can measure things like house prices and property prices and land prices, and they weren't changing. Even though there's a war raging across the society, the ordinary householder is selling houses for the same price as in other periods, and it reflects the fact that people didn't think that fundamental property values were challenged. So England is extraordinarily stable, and because of that, records that were established in the Middle Ages sat in the same palace all the way through, which was never destroyed, never damaged, and then in the case of one of these great sets of medieval records, someone pulled them out of a cupboard in 1930 and said, oh, we have a 200-year record of 50 different farms in England from 1209 till 1453, and it's all still perfectly legible. And so that you get this, as I say, this amazing set of records, so that we know things like work hours even in the Middle Ages from these extensive records. And the other thing was it was a society also where there was extensive record keeping. We run into other societies where there are no records. People just don't maintain records. So that's the wonderful thing about England. The tragedy is, of course, that we have all of this data largely because English history is actually pretty boring. Right? It's because so little happened in English history that we have such a complete record. Much more exciting societies with rebellions, incredible regime changes, massacres, they tend to have many fewer records, right? And so it's one of the ironies of history that you tend to get good records from places that tend to look like your own and don't tend to have a lot of interesting things happening. And so with those records in England, we can establish a measure of actual real income in the society or of real wages that goes back all the way from 1800 to about 1200. And as I say, you could do this either with wages or with income. We have good enough data that we can also estimate not just the wages, but the total income of the society. And what's the stylized finding of that 600-year record? If you take wages, so if we just concentrate on wages, the basic story is this. There's a period of extraordinary prosperity around about 1450. There's a period of relative poverty around about 1300. And then, as we approach the modern era, what we find is actually a pretty flat wage record. Now, the problem with this is that since it has these huge movements, it's very hard to conclude, oh, systematically, there's no upwards or downwards tendency in wages over this period. But the interesting thing is that for the earliest year we can record, estimated wages are about the same as in 1800, right? That over these 600 years, there's simply no sign of any systematic tendency for wages to move upwards. And in fact, what's much more dramatic in the pre-industrial period are these episodic declines and rises within this period in real wages. And if we're talking about what the top of this curve is, for certain classes of workers, their income was about twice as high here as it was in 1800, their wage level. And for some of these workers, agricultural workers in 1450, they didn't get wages as high as that again in England until the 20th century. Right? It was more than 100 years after the Industrial Revolution before their wages again caught up with the level of wages in this late medieval period. Okay? And then at the bottom here, wages are only about 75% of what they are at the end. But as I say, it really is kind of a surprising and kind of stunning confirmation of this idea that there's just no upwards tendency in wages in the pre-industrial world, and it's really, really flat. Right? And the thing that I say that makes this surprising to us historians is that this period between 1600 and 1800 was one of incredible intellectual development, of a lot of scientific development. It's one where England is preparing for the Industrial Revolution. The society is actually changing in many other ways in this period. And people tended to assume that that must be associated then with very significant increases in average living standards across the society. And so it is surprising to find that despite all of that change, between 1200, when almost everyone's illiterate, and 1800, the average worker is actually not any better off. Now, as I say, one of the reasons that this is controversial, and this is something that maybe Nick will have time to talk about in a section, is that the consumption goods have changed very dramatically between these two periods. And it's always difficult to compare two societies if they're consuming very different things. So by this period in England, even average workers would consume things like tea, coffee. Large numbers of people are literate now, and so there are pamphlets, there are newspapers, and so that, they also have sugar, which they did not have in their diet earlier, which is, of course, a health catastrophe because a large number of people become essentially toothless in this society as a result of the arrival of cheap sugar. There's also spices from the tropics, a whole range of new things. There's a lot of more information about the rest of the world. Art is very different. You get actual realistic portrayals of people, which you didn't really get around about 1200. And so some people say, well, you just can't compare. I mean, somehow this measure is missing out all of that increasing complexity and increasing range of consumption that people have in this period. But the way we try and measure this is simply to say, look, there's always a trade-off, right? There's always a trade-off between goods. If I get tea but less meat, then that's going to have some value to me. There's going to be a cost to having less meat in order to have tea. And the way we can measure that trade-off is by what the relative amounts people will pay for these goods. And then we can keep chaining backwards and say, well, if I can't compare people in 1800 with people in 1200 directly, but I can compare 1800 to 1799, right? And in that period, it's just changing a little bit the basket of goods that people are consuming. And I can say, well, based on that measure, were they better off, right? And then we go from 1799 to 1798. And again, we do an approximation and say, based on those measures, are we better off? And if it's done correctly, we should be able to chain all the way back and say, well, now I can say that this person in 1200 who consumed only, who never saw tea, who never saw these spices, who never consumed sugar, is still as well off as this person here because they're getting a much higher consumption of these other goods that people are still consuming in this period, such as wheat or meat or leisure or other things like that, right? But it's a very tricky endeavor to do it over these very long periods. And so that's why it's always going to be somewhat controversial about what relative living standards are. By the way, we still face this absolutely in the modern period in terms of measuring how quickly our incomes are increasing. Because, when, the iPhone arrives, how much has that increased the consumption possibilities of America, right? How do you measure that, right? How do we compare ourselves now with people in 1800 who didn't have the possibility for sending instantly to each other mainly empty messages, right? It's a new world, but the only way we can do that is by looking at, well, how much when this thing is first introduced are people willing to pay for this new technology, right? That's how we try and estimate the value of that good, and then as more and more people consume it, its relative price goes down. We try and estimate, well, how much is that improving the welfare of people, right? But it's actually a very big problem within economics, which is doing these welfare comparisons. And we'll see that one of the conclusions we're going to find here is that societies like Japan, China, and India were much poorer than pre-industrial Europe. But you run into this consumption issue again because they consumed a very different basket of goods, right? There's very little alcohol consumption in Asia. There's huge amounts in Europe. There's rice in Asia, but there's not rice in Europe. There's cotton clothing in Asia, but not so much cotton clothing in Europe. There's tea is a very important item of consumption in China. It's actually, until places like England in 1800, it's very modest amounts of consumption. And so there's actually been some debate about, well, exactly how close are these living standards? And we'll see that there's another way of getting at this, which actually is using something called angle curves, which I'll come and explain in a little bit, right? But you've got to be aware that, as I say, all of these comparisons of living standards, they work easily if we're comparing two people in Davis who have the same consumption possibilities and we just look at, well, how much is their income, right? But when these relative prices, consumption possibilities change dramatically, it's always going to be debatable exactly how well off are people, okay? So that's the overall pattern. Now the question comes up, well, why were incomes so high around about 1450? Why was there this golden era? And between this low point in 1300 and the high point in 1450 in England, real wages tripled. So in 150 years, real wages of workers in agriculture tripled in English society. And it turns out that, as far as we can tell, it's actually a nice application of the Malthusian model that exactly explains this. Because why wages were going down in this early period was that living conditions were relatively good and population was increasing. And so England, around about 1300, achieved its maximum population before the 18th century, right? And it's a very densely populated society at that point. And remember, in the Malthusian world, anytime population increases, wages should decline. And so we observe exactly this phenomena here. Then what happened is, initially, wages began to rise here because there was a huge famine in Europe from 1315 to 17. The year after the famine, wages were 10% higher in England. There's an immediate response, and population declined by about 10%, right? And so you actually see, exactly this effect that if you just take away 10% of the population, you'll drive up wages, you'll drive up incomes across the society, okay? And then what really caused this huge rise in wages was the arrival in 1349 of something that we now call the Black Death. And as the important thing about all historical episodes is that they tend to get named by people much later, right? So the important thing is you don't know what era you're living in now, right? And you don't know is this going to be, the beginning of the end? Is it going to be, the golden years before the meltdown of the world climate? We don't know what the significance of the age we're living is. It'll only be later that we'll actually come to that. Just like we'll see that in the Industrial Revolution period, no one knew that they were living during the Industrial Revolution. It's actually still gradual enough that it's only later that people discovered that there had been this thing, the Industrial Revolution, in this period. And so similarly, the Black Death is actually a later name by historians for this affliction that descended on Europe 1348 to 1350. And we're not certain exactly what the Black Death was. The modern consensus view is that it was bubonic plague. It's a bacterial infection. And it's actually endemic in rats. And so it tends to rage when people live in close proximity to rats. And what actually happens is that it starts with an epidemic amongst the animals. And when the rats die, they have fleas that then leave them and seek a secondary host in humans, and they transmit the infection to the humans in that way. And if you think, and what happened when it struck in Europe was it would kill more than 80% of people who were infected. This was a society which had not seen, as far as we know, anything like this in living memory. When it arrived in these towns and cities in Europe, it would typically carry people off within a week. And so what you would actually see when it arrived in communities is within a few months, you could lose 80% of the population of towns would just be gone. And if you survived, you were fine, right? It had no long-lasting effect. And what happens is, and it has horrible symptoms. There's these black swellings in your groin and armpits. There's a horrible smell. And you get overwhelmed, essentially, by the waste products of the bacteria. And now it actually can be treated by antibiotics, it's still endemic in parts of the world. But antibiotics will treat well. In fact, interestingly, it's in the wildlife in California. And so occasionally people in California die because it's not recognized by a doctor that this is what they got, okay? And so and as I say, we don't know for certain what it was, right? But we do know that this disease spread across Europe. We can measure its path from town to town. People fleeing the disease, when they took their possessions with them, would often carry the disease with them to other places. And it afflicted almost all of Europe in this period. And we estimate now that it eliminated about half the population in Europe, right? And so somewhere like England, we think within one summer, about half the population disappeared as a result of this disease. And the problem was it didn't just strike once. It then continued to strike in Europe all the way into the 18th century. And in this period, in the medieval period, it was striking every 10 or 15 years. There would be new episodes, new outbreaks of the plague. And London is devastated by the plague in the 17th century, even. And there's an outbreak in Marseille in the 18th century. And so it didn't, as I say, it never disappeared from the world. And one of the mysteries is actually, why did it disappear from Europe, right? But in the years that it raged, it kept population very low. And so the English population, which had been 6 million here, by 1450 was down to about 2.2 million people. Right? Now, England now has 50 million people. And so this was a very small population. It was a very small population by the standards of Asia. Right? It was a very lightly populated country by 1450. And one of the consequences, of the dramatic consequence of this, is simply that when population goes down, and remember the plague, it left all of the infrastructure. It left all of the housing. It left everything else. It just reduced the stock of people. And the consequence of that was that the survivors became enormously rich. And by 1450, the small group that was still there were actually living very, very well. Okay? The interesting thing is we can actually, through these incredible records we have, we can follow week by week what's happening to things like wages as the plague strikes. And the amazing thing is that all prices change after the plague strikes. Wages go up immediately. It's the week after the plague has gone. Wages have increased by 50% in the English society, right? You can really see that it's incredible adaptability of the economy. And all other prices tend to change as well. So things that are made with human labor become more expensive. Things that are made involving land, which is now abundant, all become rapidly, relatively less expensive. And it's all sorted out in the market economy within the week after the plague. And as I say, it's an amazing testament to how devastating a blow these societies could take, but apparently still function. Sorry, yeah. And as I say, the other thing is, I mean, spiritually, this was a world where people lived in fear of God, right? And I have seen, the wills of people in this period, and they really believed there was an afterlife, and that you had to prepare for that afterlife, and their wills contain all kinds of monies that are paid to priests to pray for them in purgatory in order that they can more quickly get into paradise, right? And so they really thought of that as a kind of physics of the world. And so at the time, if you think about it, this really must have been viewed as God's judgment on a sinful world. I mean, that it's given the mindset of people at that time, it really was a kind of a dramatic confirmation that you had sinned. And in fact, it led to all kinds of religious upheavals in parts of Europe and intense persecution of Jews in places like Germany, who were viewed as being the source of this malignity. So in that terms, though, what we actually see then is this very nice confirmation in English history of the Malthusian model. No upwards trend, very sharp response of wages to population. And also when the plague became less severe, population began to grow again very rapidly in England. What you see is an immediate decline in living standards along with that growth in population. And so the first thing we actually find in terms of the country we have the best evidence for is that in that sense, it really looks like the Malthusian model works. But what we're going to see, though, when we come to look in detail at fertility and mortality is that even though it works at this gross level, there's troubles in the boiler room in the sense that it turns out in England it's very hard to show using conventional sources that mortality increased when living standards went down, or that fertility declined when living standards went down as well. And in some sense, for the model to work completely, we need all of those elements to actually work. And so that's why it's still very controversial about, is this the correct description of this world? Okay, thanks a lot. Questions?